Hello, my lovely psychology students. Welcome to our first module of paper 3. Yes, we are starting with issues and debates. In this session, we're going to be focusing on one of our key issues. So we're going to start to understand what we mean by the issues within psychology. And then we're going to be focusing on ethical issues and social sensitive research. So let's first of all understand what issues are. Even though you are familiar with them, and some of you probably don't realize that you've been dealing and looking at them over the past year, issues are concerned with the key problems with research that may be hidden from view unless an effort is made to uncover and acknowledge them. We have been doing this when we've been looking at research when it comes to evaluation. We've been looking at ethical issues, gender issues, cultural issues. Now, in this module, these are the 3 issues that we're going to be looking at. And it's about highlighting that, hold on, even though we're getting a lot of valid information from the research, we do still have some issues that we need to be aware of. And that's what the issues is about. It's about bringing them out into the open so that we are aware that this research isn't perfect, that there are some issues and that we are aware of those issues. So we're going to start with ethical issues. This is something that we've been doing all year. And we're going to be looking at the ethical implications in research and theory. So we're going to be looking at how it impacts on research and theory. Spec link, let's make a little link on what we're covering today. Ethical implications, so we're going to be looking at the ethical issues, the implication of these issues, and how it becomes and what is social sensitivity research. So quite a few. So we're going to be building on our knowledge of what we know of ethical issues, and then we're going to be developing them. So my first question is a bit of a recap. Ethical issues, what are they? So what I'd like you to do in a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the video, write down what are the ethical issues. Remember, we're not looking for solutions to the ethical issues. We're just looking at what are the ethical issues and give a brief explanation of those. You should be able to do this closed book, but if you are struggling, go back to your textbook or your notes, have a read, then answer the question. So I would like you to pause the video now. Great stuff. Thank you so much for pausing. Now, remember, we're going to have a quick look at your answers. I'm not looking for solutions. I'm just looking for the ethical issues and what they are. Your ethical issues are deception, lack of informed consent, harm, we've both got psychological and physical, and privacy and confidentiality. So really we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Please note, the right to withdraw is not an ethical issue. It's a solution to if somebody's starting to feel anxious, a little bit of psychological harm, or they no longer want to be part of it because they're feeling uncomfortable. That's just one way that we can use the right to withdraw. So it's not an ethical issue. Deception, what have you got? Deception, this is when the participants are not told 100% of the truth. So that means we could either leave something out, we could tell them something different. So for example, we tell them a different aim. We don't tell them that all the participants, perhaps some of them are Confederates. So, or like I said previous, we don't tell them everything. We leave things out, we just don't add it in. So we're not actually telling them an untruth, but we're not giving them all the information. If there is deception, there's always going to be a lack of fully informed consent. Really important that we get with consent. Lack of informed consent is an issue because every participant should be told all the details, the true aim, true procedures, what's going to happen with the findings and everything, so that they can make a fully informed choice to take part in the research. So lack of fully informed consent because of deception. Then we've got harm. Psychological, so it can cause them in simple things like embarrassment, a higher level of anxiety, to perhaps more severe issues. Physical harm, we shouldn't cause any form of physical harm to our participants. Not at all. Privacy, that means a participant has the right not to give you certain information. So confidentiality is the data that they have given you or the information that they have given you should not be spread or given to other individuals. So there is a difference here, remember that, between privacy and confidentiality. Okay, great, we've had a little bit of a recap. So these are our ethical issues. And from these ethical issues, they may arise conflict within the research, and it is important that we take these into account. Now, it could be conflict in lots of different ways, and this is what we're going to be discussing throughout this section when we look at these ethical implications. Now, ethical implications. First question is, what do we mean by this? What do we mean? What does it mean? It's really important that you understand the word implication. We've looked at this implication. Remember in class when we've looked at the implication of research for the economy? So what effect does the research have on economic issues? Now we're looking at ethical implications. What does this mean? So it's considering the impact or consequences that psychological research has on the rights of other people in the wider context, not just the participants taking part in the research. So when we're looking at the implications, we're looking at how does implication, the effects of, how does it impact on? So we look at how it impacts on the participant, but we've also got to look at it in the bigger picture. How does it affect the participant's family? How does it affect the researchers? How does it affect certain social groups? How does it affect policy making? How does it affect society as a whole? So it's looking at the impact or the consequences that the psychological research has on the rights of other people beyond those just in the research. So we're looking to affect, how does it affect? What type of effect does it have on those beyond the research? So let's look at the idea of research and ethical implications. Researchers take time to plan, prepare, and use utmost control to carry out the research and treat participants in the best possible way. Please note, 99.9999%, so really all of our psychological research, they want to make sure that the research is valid. So they are going to plan and prepare. That's why it goes through. Remember when we looked at the idea of our work has to get scrutinized through an ethical committee, and we're doing cost benefit analysis, because you want to fully prepare to carry out these so that when you do get your findings, there's going to be that strong level of validity there. So it's really important. However, doesn't matter how well a researcher plans and prepares and how well they carry it out to protect their participants and carry it out in a very rigid and stringent way to get the best possible results. There are areas in which researchers have no control over. And it's the representation of the research by the media. It's how the media takes that research and how they actually emphasize it, how they actually publicize it, how they put their spin on it. I think you get the drift. I can remember a few years ago, not psychologically orientated, but it was for the MMRI jabs that you give babies. And a researcher carried out a piece of research, and it was just the start of his research. So it was like the first part of his research in the long process. And he found that there may be a small positive correlation between this inoculation injection that infants get and autism. But this positive correlation was so weak. However, the media took it and they said MRI jabs is associated with the development of autism. And you know what? A lot of children didn't get inoculated, and this inoculation was really important. The media took it, they blew it up, and caused, in essence, a little bit of a moral panic. So, and that's one thing researchers cannot control, is how the media take it and what parts they're going to emphasize. The impact of their work on public policy. They may do a research and they're identifying key things, and then governments take it, and actually it's how they interpret it and how they're going to put it into policy. And it could be completely out of context. And we're going to be looking at a little bit of research later on that does actually look at that type of thing, how it takes it out of context, or it uses in a way that actually is very discriminating, but they see it doing it for the better good of the society as a whole. And also how it influences the perception of specific groups within society. Certain research may be taken and it may highlight certain social groups within society. That could be social class, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation. It could be a whole spectrum of different areas. And actually, this research could then influence how others see that social group. And unfortunately, these are areas that researchers do not have control. That's why they've got to be aware that there can be implications of their work. And that's why it's so important how researchers decide how they're going to publish their work, when it's going to be published, how they plan, prepare, and work with their participants. So it's really important that the researcher takes as much control and insight as possible to carry out their research in the best possible way, and also how it's going to be publicized in the sense of how it's going to get published into the psychological journals and in that type of context. Let's bring in a little bit of AO3 here with regards to the points that we've just been making. It is of utmost importance for the researcher to frame their question correctly and carry out their research in the best possible way. So we're highlighting the importance of this doing. So really, when you look at that point, it's not really a strength or a limitation. Here we've got interpretation and analysis, and remember that is still part of AO3. It's not just evaluation. Cyber and Cyber in 88 highlighted that this is not done, if this is not done, so it can cause the research to be misinterpreted. So actually, just as important as their research question is and then creating of their hypotheses, is really important that they get the word right, that wording right. Otherwise, it could lead to misinterpretation, and that becomes a major problem. Research into alternative research by Kitzener and Coyle in 95 found to be heterosexual bias, as homosexual relationships were compared and judged by heterosexual norms. So here, when they were doing research into alternative relationships, they found that within the research, and probably even in their question, that the interpretation of the research was carried out by the research would have heterosexual bias. So they were using a heterosexual, getting tongue-tied here, a heterosexual concepts, norms, and values to do the interpretation. And actually, that became the problem. What do you think the implications of this would be? I want to take you a moment. I need to speak properly now. I want you to take a moment, pause the video, and write down, based on what you know, that if we are studying alternative type relationships, but we're using a heterosexual point of view to do the analysis, what problems can that be? Let's pause now. Great, thank you for pausing. Let's see what you came up with. Well, hopefully maybe you've come up with probably a few more things than I've got here. The relationships, the homosexual relationships, bisexual relationships, but could be seen as being deviant because they don't meet the norms of the heterosexual relationships. So if something doesn't meet the norms, it's being deviant. They could be regarded as being irrational because it doesn't form the rational way of forming a relationship in a heterosexual manner. So that's labeling these type of relationships, but also it could marginalize. Marginalize, that means taking these individuals or these social groups and kind of pushing them out of mainstream. And actually, we can see that's happened in this community of homosexual relationships. We can see that in another video that we're looking at them fighting for their social rights. But we could marginalize these individuals, couples, and the social groups and give them a certain stigma because they're not meeting the norm in relationships. So yes, it is a problem down to how we word the question, down to how we analyze the data. It's really, really important that the researcher tries to minimize all these issues which could cause problems. And again, this causes an ethical issue, an ethical implication, because we're doing these individuals who have an alternative type of sexual orientation. It's going to impact on their life. It's going to make their life more difficult. So a nice AO3. Another AO3 that we can link in here. Using psychological research can result in changes in legislation that has a negative effect on society. So just like I've mentioned prior in our AO1, it can have a negative effect. It can allow for certain social groups to be targeted as they may be seen as a drain on society. It's a bit harsh, isn't it? Now, what I'd like you to do in your textbook on page 106 and 107, and remember we're in the Pink Girl textbook, we're on the second year textbook for this one. What I'd like you to do to help make sense of the first two sentences, I would like you to identify what happened in America in the 1920s and 30s based on the research of Goddard in 1917. So what I'd like you to do is, in a moment you're going to pause. I'd like you to read, you'll find on the top of page 107, the research on Goddard, and under the title of Social Control, still on page 107 in the textbook, have a read there, and then actually answer the question. So I'd like you to pause now. Great stuff. Thank you for pausing. I really hope you have, because I really want you to be interacting with this. So let's look at what happened in America in the 1920s and 30s based on the research of Goddard. Now, first of all, we need to understand Goddard's research. Goddard's research into IQ and immigration found them to be feeble-minded. Yes, in America around about that time, there was a lot of people coming from Europe into America. And as they arrived, he got them to complete an IQ test. And he actually claimed that the majority of the immigrants, Russians, Jews, Hungarians, Italians, were feeble-minded. So that means feeble-minded of lower intelligence. So, okay, yes, we know we have the issue, and you probably read it in the textbook, that majority of these immigrants coming in had either couldn't speak English or had a little grasp of the English language. Don't you think that would influence them answering the questions? And also probably the IQ test was based on American knowledge. But if you're coming from Russia or Italy, do you think you're going to have knowledge of America? You're going to have the historical knowledge and general knowledge of your own country. So yes, there's lots of issues there But he identified and he published that immigrants are feeble-minded. Okay, so we've got the research. What is this telling us about social control in the 1920s and 30s? And this is where this research had actually influenced legislation in America. Legislation was changed. There was legislation in quite a lot of the states, not all of the American states, but a lot of the American states, to sterilize feeble-minded individuals. Now, this feeble-minded individuals would include people that were of low intelligence, feeble-minded immigrants. It also included alcoholics, drug addicts, people that were mentally ill. But this links to this feeble-minded individuals of having a lower intelligence. So actually they were sterilizing so these individuals couldn't breed because they were seen as unfit. And because they were seen as unfit, they would cost society more money, and there'd be a drain on the funds and on the economy and the government provision. So they saw this as, if we don't allow them to breed, they're not going to carry on this type of individual within our society. How severe is that? So yeah, again, it highlights the fact that researchers cannot control what happens once they've published it and it's out in the public, what happens with the research. So let's look at this idea of socially sensitive research. Now, I've mentioned this before in class, socially sensitive research. It involves studies that have a potential to have a negative impact on a specific individuals within the research group or groups of people or society in general. So socially sensitive research is when it has a negative impact on the participants and those beyond that situation. So the participant's family. I suppose an example of socially sensitive research would be Milgram's original study. Because look at the distress that happened on the participants. Yes, I understand they went through a debrief at the end, so which would have dealt with some of the issues. But imagine going home and saying to your wife, because in the original study it was all men, dear, well, I can't do an American accent here. Dear, hi. No, that's even worse. Right, dear, I killed a man today just because somebody gave me an order. But I didn't really kill him, but I killed him. Don't you think, how did that impact? And when this was published, how did that impact on society? Actually, Milgram didn't recover. You know, a lot of researchers didn't want to work with Milgram after this was published. So it had an effect beyond the research. People potentially affected, so just to condense what I've been rambling on about, participants themselves and beyond the study, people close to them, their family, their friends, their working colleagues, the social groups in which they're drawn from, their ethnicity, their culture, their religion, the researcher themselves and their institution, the institution that they belong to. So really, there can be a social sensitive, it's when it affects are so great that it is a negative effect. It has a negative event. Going back to Milgram, he found it very difficult and he didn't do much research after his research into obedience and those areas. So it really did have an effect. A lot of institutions didn't want to employ him because they didn't want to be labeled because of who he was and what he had done. Because he made realize that actually normal everyday American men can do horrendous acts. It wasn't that Germans were the evil bunch. So socially sensitive research has a negative impact. Why do researchers need to be cautious? Good question. They need to be cautious because socially sensitive research has the potential to affect many, many lives, many, many people. By its nature, it attracts the attention of other psychologists and the media and the public. So if it is a little bit sensitive or a little bit controversial, the media will get hold of it, other psychologists will want to scrutinize it, the public will get more interested in it. So really, they need to be cautious because they don't have any control over what other psychologists do with it, what the media does with it, and how it sits with the public. This can lead to misinterpretation or focusing on specific aspects of the research rather than the research as a whole and within the context it's supposed to be looked at. So it really highlights that social sensitivity research needs to be done very cautiously. Does social sensitive research contain an element of risk, of threat? Yes, it does. According to Lee, it says it does have an element of risk or threat. Topics, for example, that are private, stressful, or sacred. You know, doing research that are very stressful. Look at Milgram's research, it was highly stressful. And you kind of think, oh, we should just stay away with that. We'll just let everyone believe that Germans are evil, that Milgram had hypothesized. We shouldn't touch things like that. Or potential for exposing of incriminating or stigmatizing information. Because sometimes when you do research, you might come out with findings that actually may stigmatize or show a discrimination between certain social groups, certain countries, certain cultures. So when it comes to socially sensitive research, it is a very sensitive area. So what reason can the research become socially sensitive? Well, there's lots of reasons why research can become socially sensitive. The research question itself, just the research question itself. Now, you might kind of think to yourself, well, then why do it? Well, don't we have an obligation to study those areas so that we become more informed? It can become the treatment of participants can make it. Look at Zambaro's prison study and how those participants were treated. Really became socially sensitive there. The institutional context. You know, what is the institution that's allowing the research to carry out? What do they stand for? What do they represent? They might be quite a controversial research group. So therefore, it could become, just because of that, the research automatically labeled as being socially sensitive. And as we've been saying all along as well, the interpretation and the use of the findings and the overall validity of the research. Now I want to link in this idea of the overall validity of the research. Some findings that are presented perhaps as objectives, years later, they can be re-examined and actually kind of find that they're not valid. And therefore, that becomes the issue. But in more modern day society, we are becoming good when it comes to the validity here. And we've used this word reflexivity before, that a lot of research tackle the social sensitive areas of research are much more upfront about their own biases and their preconceptions. So therefore, they identify what they are, they publish them within their work. We've looked at reflexivity before when we looked at content analysis, that when we're analyzing qualitative data, if we identify perhaps our biases in that area and we become aware of them, but we also publish them alongside our work, it will help deal with the socially sensitive issues. It's showing that awareness. So there are many reasons why the research itself can become socially sensitive. Now, I'm going to give you a study in a minute. We're going to have a read through, then you're going to answer the question, why would this study be socially sensitive research? Rain carried out brain scans of violent criminals. He found that they tend to have subtle damage to areas of the brain associated with impulse control. He suggested that this type of brain damage is a marker for violent criminality and that a great deal of misery, not to mention money, could be saved if early in the life of children were screened for these markers and something could be done about it. I'd like you to pause the video and write down why you think the study could be socially sensitive. Remember, socially sensitive research, it has a negative effect beyond the research situation. Over to you. Let's have a pause. Great stuff. Thank you for pausing. Hopefully you've taken your time and kind of think, well, how would this research affect life? How would it affect the life of these individuals? How would it affect the life of the families, the societies? Okay, first of all, stigma as a family, that you have a child that may have this marker and therefore what you like as a family. Are you a criminal as a family as well? Is it criminality that runs through the whole family? Just imagine screening your child and it has that issue with its impulse control when it's small, and then they decide, well, we need to do this to it, but actually, will that child actually grow up and have control issues? They could, but they may not either. So what harm are you going to do to those children? Or it might even lead to actually saying to the mother and father, we're going to sterilize you and you're not going to have any more kids. So it's taking away their rights. And then in society, might actually start to have these stereotypical views of, well, it's a criminal family. And can you just see how it's going to escalate beyond that situation? Meanwhile, this isn't 100%. It's saying that they had that in common. But there could have been a whole pile of other factors that caused these individuals to become violent criminals, not just perhaps the damage to that particular area in the brain. So something to ponder. I'm sure you came up with a few more. I mean, if you want, you can email me and tell me what you came up with. I'd really be interested to know. But it's about you thinking, how could this research affect the lives of society? Just imagine how it could affect social policy. Maybe certain social policy is that when the child is in the womb, it has to be screened. And if it has this, an abortion has to happen. Whoa! Just imagine that. And how that will affect, there'll be a lot of women not going for these screenings just to prevent them from aborting their child, because they'd only be able to pick this up at a later stage. So just imagine if legislation or laws came in that happened today. Whew. And this is what you've got to do when you get an implication type of question in the exam. How will it affect the lives beyond the research? Yes, it will affect certain lives within the research itself, but it can also affect the lives beyond. And that's what you've got to talk implications, the effects of. So let's move on. Views on social sensitive research should be carried out. Now, what I'm trying to say here, well, if socially sensitive topic areas will have such negative consequences, should we actually carry them out? Should we just leave them alone? Well, Scar, not him from Lion King, actually says we have a responsibility to do socially sensitive research, even if we don't like the findings. Even if we don't like what we find, we have a responsibility. Social sensitive research can be very important in raising awareness, for example, inequalities and its effects, discrimination. It is really important. Just because it can have a lot of negative consequences or we don't like what we find, we still have a responsibility to find it. Because the more we find out about it, the more we're able to deal with it, the more we're able to cope with it, the more we're able to perhaps put things in place that it prevents inequalities and discrimination. This is supported by Aronson in '92, Stopping Socially Sensitive Research, or conducting it in secret would be a backward step. It really would. It would be, in science, we want to move forward. But imagine having to do it behind closed doors. It's kind of like doing it in secret so that nobody else gets to hear about it. And actually, we want the truth to come out. So the more and more we can find out about things, and it's presented in the right manner, the more and more we start to understand it. And that's what his second point leads to. Better to educate the public about socially sensitive research so that they're able to understand it better and recognize the abuses, recognize the inequality, recognize the discrimination, recognize the effects. So that means society becomes better informed. So therefore, this idea that ignorance is bliss, no, it's about creating that awareness so that we can deal with it better. So views, should it be carried out? Well, according to Scar and Arison, yes, it should be. It shouldn't be done closed doors, and it should be out there for everyone to become aware of. So we're going to finish up here with a nice exam question, something for you to get your teeth in. So here we have a nice STEM. In a study of antisocial activity and social background, researchers interviewed 100 children aged 14 years. They then classified each child according to their level of antisocial activity. They concluded that 26 were very antisocial, 40 were mildly antisocial, and 34 were not antisocial. The researchers found that the majority of the very antisocial children attended a Crayford Secondary School, whereas most of the other two groups of children attended another local school. So we've got our STEM. You'll have time again to read over it. Now here's our question. Briefly explain how the researchers could have dealt with the issue of social sensitivity in the study, 4 marks. Okay, so briefly explain. So they're not looking for tons of detail, but we want an explanation how the researchers could have dealt with the socially sensitivity in this study. So how? What would they actually do? But it's not quite straightforward. In this question, have dealt with the issue of socially sensitive research in the study. So we need to highlight what is the social sensitive issues within the study, and then how can we deal with it. We can't just talk on about this is how you could deal with it. We'll deal with what? The social sensitive issues within this study, right? With issues in this study. So first of all, I know it says how the research could deal with it, so we've got to do that with the issue of social sensitivity in this study. So let's talk about what the social sensitive issues are, and then how would they deal with it. Over to you. Pause the video. Great stuff. Thank you for pausing. Again, let's just quickly recap the question. Briefly explain how the researcher could have dealt with the issue of social sensitivity in this study. First of all, we know it's AO2. How and in this study it tells us. There's 2 parts to this question. 2 parts. It's how they would deal with the social sensitive issues, and what are the social sensitive issues in this study. So we've got to do those 2 things in order to get our 4 marks. So what I'd like you to do is grab your different color pen so that you can annotate your answer. So, and then you can mark at the end. I'm going to start off with what are the social sensitive issues in this study. Now, I don't need to mention every single one of them because it does say briefly explain. So I'm going to briefly explain what they are. Then I'm going to talk about how I'm going to deal with it. So first of all, the researcher should be aware of the implications of the research and the positive negative impact of the children in the sample and their families. How it can label them as being deviant and may lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. For those who don't know what a who don't know what a self-fulfilling prophecy is, if you do sociology, you should. Self-fulfilling prophecy is if you're told something often enough, you start to believe it, and therefore you carry it out. So that label you're given, so if you've been labeled that actually, according to our research, even though you're not doing it, you are very antisocial, and that's, you kept being told that, then you're going to then start to believe it, and that's as if it's making a prophecy on how you're going to behave. Also, the possible negative implications on the reputation of Crayford School and the wider community as being known as being an antisocial area. So there we are. We've got implications on the child and their family, but also the school and the greater community. And it's nicely applied. So the issues of social sensitivity in the study, we've got them there. Now, how are we going to deal with them? Research should take an adequate steps to counter the above mentioned issues by giving sensitive briefings and debriefings of participants, parents, and teachers. So we have a very sensitive briefing, so standardized instructions, what they need to do, and debriefing. Make sure it's very sensitive and it deals with the issues, because imagine being told that actually your social background is indicating that you are very antisocial. It's really sensitive stuff here. So they've got to be very careful when it comes to that, but also take much care when it comes to the publication and disclosure of the results to make sure that they stay confidential and anonymous. So it's really important that when they publish their findings, that any personal detail is going to be kept confidential and anonymous. You're not sharing personal details of what the school's called, what the participants are, what the general area is. All of that needs to be kept anonymous. And that's the way of how the researchers could deal with these social sensitive issues. I hope this makes a lot of sense. If not, go back over it, listen to it again. If not, email me, and then we can work on it further. So remember, you know the drill by now. Go through the video again, pause as you go through each slide, make your notes, refer back to your textbook as well to bulk out your notes. And you can start your new folder, paper 3 folder. And within that, you will need to have your section for your issues and debate. Remember as well, let's start that glossary, because there's quite a lot of words in here that you will want to link in. It's important to know your terminology so that you can understand the questions and you can use them within your answer within the right context. Well, happy working, and remember, I'm at the end of an email. Take care.